As scary as this is to say, I'm really starting to think that the whole world is insane, and I am one of the few truly rational people out there. Even people that I respect, I'm seeing them ignore the facts in favor of their emotions, and it really isn't the kind of world that I want to live in. It's getting more and more disheartening by the minute. No, I'm not necessarily talking about the lunatics all over social media, the people on the far right that are acting just as immaturely as the people on the far left. But you have to understand that rejecting one side's emotionally comforting insanity doesn't give you license to simply insert your own. And that's what I'm seeing a lot these days. So, I wanted to explore a couple of cases that I've seen recently that are really just driving me out of my mind. The first, since I recently did a long video addressing it, has to do with discrimination and legality. The problem is, there are no laws in this country, at least not that I'm aware of, that prohibit discrimination based on political ideology. We can argue whether there should be or not, but currently, at least to my knowledge, they don't exist, at least on the federal level. Companies can discriminate freely based on any criteria outside of federal strict scrutiny categories. And those strict scrutiny categories at present include race, national origin, legal alienage, gender, age, and some health-related problems. Companies cannot discriminate on any of those things. And while the government isn't allowed to discriminate on the basis of political positions, I don't believe that the Supreme Court has turned that into a strict scrutiny category applicable to businesses. Now, a business can be found guilty if they disallow political discussion by one political lean, but not another. But that's part of labor law. In the case of YouTube, since that's what I was talking about, none of the people uploading videos actually work for YouTube. Hence, they're not employees, and therefore, labor law simply does not apply to them. Whether you want these things to change or not, and I'd be fine if they do, but just because you want the laws to be different doesn't mean that the laws are actually different. If you really want the laws to change, get the laws changed through the legal methods already enshrined in law. You can't just pretend that the law is what you want it to be. But far too many people do. So let's look at a common refrain that comes from the right when the simple facts that private companies doing what YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and other companies are doing is perfectly within their legal rights, no matter how reprehensible I personally find their actions. They bring up the gay bakers as though they ought to be able to do whatever they want to do. Except, at least in the case that is most often talked about, there were existing local laws that made what they were doing illegal. Whether you like it or not, we've got this thing called the rule of law, and if the law applies to you, be it a local law, a state law, or a federal law, then you are both legally and ethically bound to follow that law or face civil or criminal penalties for violating the law should you do so. Those bakers were violating an existing law to which they were bound and agreed to follow. YouTube, at least as far as I can discover, is not. Of course, I hate what YouTube is doing, but that doesn't mean they aren't legally permitted to do so. That's just the world that we currently live in. But that doesn't stop a lot of people on the far political right from demanding, just as the regressive left does, that reality not only should be something that it's not, but that it is actually something that it's not. And that's the problem, because the world is going to be what the world is, no matter what wishes and dreams and delusions you happen to hold. That's the only way we can have a functional society. Neither side gets to declare their imaginary utopia real because it makes them feel good to believe it's so. Not the far left, not the far right, but more and more often, I'm seeing both sides pretend that they get to call the shots and declare anything that falls outside of their emotional comfort zone irrelevant. And in that, they're really no different than the religious who think they can posit imaginary friends and magically they must be real because feelings. And this is why I declare all of them to be irrational and place irrationality as the true enemy of humanity. See, you don't get to simply declare that your ideas are real without being able to show that they actually are. And that goes for every aspect of reality. There are no exceptions for anyone. And this brings me to another example that I see constantly, mostly on Gab and Minds, and that's the absurd racism of the far alt-right. I mean, these people are truly immature children of the worst sort. They're no different than the radical racists on the left, and they use most of the same arguments and engage in almost identical debating methods. They are conspiracy theorists. They believe that everyone is out to get them if they have a different skin color. They blame the Jews for everything, and they're pushing for a white homeland, apparently without regard to a common cultural identity. I guess they think that all white people have the same cultural ideas simply because they're white, all evidence to the contrary aside. These people are nuts. And unfortunately, the nuttiness doesn't end there. Now, I had this debate over on Gab as I was writing this with someone who was convinced that the entire government was made up of psychopaths. And there is just this grand conspiracy somehow that these psychopaths are going to falsify every vote in every election for their own nefarious desires. And in his defense, he presented a book which he had clearly never looked at intellectually. He had just bought into it because it confirmed his already insane bias about the world he lived in. So I asked him if he had ever looked at the actual data cited in the book. Did he have a conversant understanding of the author's data and whether or not it might have actually supported the claims that were made? Well, no, of course not. He hadn't done anything but read it and insert it into his daft conspiracy theory. But it was all true. He could tell me that. He just couldn't tell me how he knew. And these are just a very few of the absurd number of cases I can relate, where people believe things for emotional reasons that they cannot intellectually articulate, then demand that they're rational when all evidence proves otherwise. These people are no different from the religious, and when it's painfully obvious that they are operating not on rationality but on emotion, as these cases clearly show, how the people who are blatantly guilty of emotional gullibility can be so totally blind to their own errors, I will never understand. Is it any wonder why the planet is such a disaster when people are incapable of looking at data dispassionately, making decisions intellectually, and dealing with the world as it is, not as they wish it was? I'm feeling very alone in the rational club these days, and I hate it. So, what do we do about it? How do we stop people from being irrational lunatics? Because I really don't think we're going to go anywhere as a species until we can start thinking intellectually and dealing with the world critically. Unfortunately, no solutions are readily presenting themselves. Yes, we need to start teaching critical thinking from a very young age in schools, but far too many of these wackadoodles would fight that. They don't want their children to be able to think dispassionately. They want them to be fanatics, just like dear old mom and dad. And that's not necessarily a religious thing. It seems to be a human thing, but it's really ruining the planet from my perspective. Not only do these people have problems, these people are problems, regardless of their religious or irreligious beliefs, regardless of their political positions, regardless of their wild conspiracy theories. These people are holding us back as a species from actually getting to a bright future. And I don't know how to fix it or if it can even be fixed. So what do you think?